Did you know that Paul Biya and his regime pay hundreds of US dollars to United States lobbyists to ignore human rights violations, rig elections, shape US foreign policy, and influence media reporting in Cameroon? If you doubt me, ask yourself why the CNN, foreign NGOs, and even foreign governments have ignored rigged elections in Cameroon and human rights abuses while focusing all their attention on Tanzania. In Cameroon, Chiruma even published data from polling station to polling station showing that he won the elections. But still, there is no attention, there is no interest. Foreign governments, again, through their embassies, have issued statements showing that they do not trust that the results declared by the Constitutional Council reflect the results from the ballot box. But still, no action is being taken by their governments. For example, the government of Nigeria has been sanctioned by the United States government, and Tanzania is facing strict scrutiny by the United States government. Why all this? Are you asking yourself now why? Let me show you why. For example, Squire Patton Box is a United States lobbying firm that has served as one of Cameroon's contractors. This firm received $33,300 from the government of Cameroon every month. That is an equivalent of about 19 million CFA francs. This lobby firm focused on legal advisory services, engagement with the United States Congress, and high-level diplomatic support to advance Cameroon-US bilateral relations. Next, the Mercury Public Affairs. They billed Cameroon $100,000 a month. That is about 57 million francs CFA. What did they do? They interacted with the government of the United States, gave them strategic advice, engaged the media to shape the narrative about Cameroon, and explicitly aimed at countering negative coverage of human rights issues and the escalating conflict in Cameroon. Next on the list, the Glover Park Group. This one's charged $55,000 per month. That is an approximate 31 million francs CFA for strategic communication. This included message development, reaching out to policymakers in the State Department and the White House, and also media placements to foster a positive image of Cameroon. Next on the list, we have Cloud Public Affairs. They also contracted for $55,000, still 31 million, and focused on public relations. They targeted particular media houses and flushed and gave them as much information as possible, so they would write that information in their public newspapers and other media houses to give a good impression of Cameroon. Sometimes they would even ignore whatever is coming out of Cameroon. So the West and foreign governments do not even know what is happening in Cameroon. It holds same for NGOs, media, and governments, as we have already said. So this example just shows to you how the government of Cameroon uses lobbyists in the United States, in France, in Germany, China, Japan, and all the other countries where the governments could influence proceedings in Cameroon, for example, suspending aid and suspending support that they give to Cameroon. But what is interesting is that at home, these same people who pay this money to foreign lobby firms and foreign governments would make you believe that if you are collaborating with a foreign government to resolve human rights violations at home, or even to say that the elections were rigged, you are selling out the sovereignty of Cameroon and selling out natural resources. In these contracts, they give out significant natural resources contracts to whosoever is able to protect their image by simply telling these foreign media, ignore Cameroon, do not report on Cameroon. That is what they do. And it's now very evident that lobbying works. And why am I saying lobbying works? Because nobody's talking about the rigged elections in Cameroon again. CNN has run a long documentary on Tanzania, nothing about Cameroon. Trump is talking about Nigeria, nothing about Cameroon. Let me give you a list of what Trump has said about different countries, of which I know that there have been active lobbying from those countries. I'll start with South Africa. Why South Africa? Because I have interviewed the Afrikaners who led the lobbying on the South African issue, they have visited the White House, visited Washington, D.C. many times to bring to the attention of policymakers their problems as they see. As a result, Trump declared that South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly in South Africa. He was referring to the Afrikaners. You can go back to previous episodes on this podcast and you will see my interviews with the public relations departments of the Afrikaners. He also spoke seriously about the enabling seizure of ethnic minority land and agricultural property in South Africa. Trump described the situation as a serious human rights violation and called for investigations. He accused the South African government of failing to acknowledge or redress the horrific human rights abuses that are being endured by the Afrikaners. So this is just an example of what lobbying has gotten South Africans to and where they are today. So lobbying simply puts your question before the people. I know I have mentioned some sums of money there, but lobbying does not necessarily need that amount of money. It simply needs a coordinated effort where you target the right people and present your situation before them. The government of Cameroon is spending all this money because they do not suffer to get that money. They take loans from different organizations, different banks, different countries, put them together and start abusing the money at their disposal. President Trump has also declared that Nigeria is a country of particular concern because, according to him, Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria. And here there has been alleged allegations of thousands of Nigerian Christians being killed by radical Islamists. Trump has equally warned that if the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, the US government will immediately stop all the aid and assistance to Nigeria. Remember, during President Trump's first mandate, when Ambassador Tibon Nash was his Undersecretary of State for Africa, he took similar actions against the government of Cameroon. He suspended some of the military aid that went to Cameroon, and he was putting enormous pressure on Paul Biya to resolve the Ambazonian conflict, which of course he did not at the time, and the pressure was mounting, but then Trump left from office. Why am I talking about this today? Last week, I interviewed a lobbyist who represents the Biafran movement. I wanted to get from him the mindset of a lobbyist and why or how lobbyists play it differently than when citizens themselves do that lobbying on their behalf. He explained to me why the Biafrans hired him and how he took his steps to work towards the achievement of United States policy proclaimed by President Trump and now under serious considerations by the United States Congress. In that interview, I asked him about Cameroon. He knows something about Cameroon. He shared his ideas about Cameroon, and he gave me an idea of what Washington thinks about Cameroon. Of course, he knows Tibon Nash, who is a friend who has been on this podcast for a long time, and Tibon Nash is very vocal about what is happening in Cameroon. So it is time for Cameroonians, especially in the United States, to start thinking about doing the right advocacy, knowing where to touch and whom to talk to. This conversation with Elias Jurasulis is going to play immediately after this brief introduction, so you get the mindset of the lobbyists. We approached the conversation from the Nigerian side, so you also see how difficult questions, especially questions that deal with things or issues that are geostrategically and geopolitically difficult, can be managed in times like this. Generally, you would hear people say that Paul Biya is very tough and very strong in international politics. Do you now know why Paul Biya is seemingly a very tough cookie when it comes to international politics? It is because he spends your money at will. He dishes out your money. He pays the foreigners to make those decisions. And mind you, in the United States, lobbying is not illegal. It is not corruption. It's very legal. All you need to do as a lobbyist is to put in the public domain and declare with the Department of Justice and the Department of Revenue, that is the Internal Revenue Services, that you are a lobbyist. So everything is open for everybody to see. That is why my conversation with Elias Jurasulis, he was very clear that he's a lobbyist because it is required by the United States law. So watch this conversation with him and understand why Paul Biya and his regime are spending Cameroon's money as if it is peanuts. While Cameroonians cannot afford roads, they cannot afford hospitals, they have nothing. All the money is being spent by paying lobbyists around the world just to let them ignore the results of the elections. Cameroonians should not and cannot ignore the results of the elections simply because Chiruma won and Chiruma is defending that victory. So Cameroonians should stay alert and vigilant. One other important thing with having an international recognition of everything that is happening within the country is once there is that international pressure, all international eyes are looking at Cameroon, it is difficult for the government to continue violating human rights excessively because they know what has happened in Nigeria right now is the Department of State of the United States has identified certain members of government in Nigeria and has already placed bans on them. They can no longer travel to the United States as freely as they used to do. And that is just the first step. That is how it always starts. And then if no remediation is put in place by the government, things are going to escalate and you will see different actions by the United States government. Don't tell me that the United States government is not the police of the world. Once you become a beggar and you depend on another person, the piper dictates the tune. So if we have put ourselves in that condition where we depend on others, then the piper dictates the tune. And if we manage our countries in a way that we push our citizens out of the governance framework through killings, torture, unnecessary imprisonment, you are pushing your citizens to go ask for help elsewhere. So don't even start the conversation of why are you talking about the United States? Why are you asking the United States to come in? If there is any conversation towards that side of asking foreign governments to intervene, it is because the human rights violations in Cameroon are excessive. The citizens have been put out of the governance framework despite citizens taking part in the elections and voting for the person of their choice. So you open the floodgates, whatever comes in, comes in. So remember, the government of Cameroon will definitely be spending money on the lobby firms to influence decisions within Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, but citizens still have the utmost responsibility to do that for themselves. Do that for yourselves because at the end of the day, whatever the case, truth triumphs. The truth is going to triumph. All right, ladies and gentlemen, watch the conversation I had with Elias Jurasulis. It is interesting and very detailed, so enjoy. Cameroon on October 12 had presidential elections. The Constitutional Council declared Paul Biya the winner, that is the incumbent president. Issa Chiruma on the other side published results from the polling stations, and those results showed he won. But the Constitutional Council and the elections management body have not published the results polling station by polling station.
Well, what I would say is, and again, these are things that I already highlight in my capacity of representing the Ambazonians. But Paul Biya has been a longtime dictator in Africa. He's 93 now. He wants to be president until I think he's 100, which I think will be a record. And Cameroon, under his tenure, has not had free and fair elections. They've been Cameroonians, whether they be Ambazonians or other Cameroonians, have had a history of being oppressed under the Biya dictatorship. And I think someone.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome again to the Beyond Africa podcast with me, your host, Ngalim Bernard. At the Beyond African podcast, we tell African stories that change lives. Today, we are discussing not Cameroon, but the United States and Nigeria. All this because it is important within the global context of Cameroon and Africa. Why? You'll get to understand that in the course of the conversation. President Trump recently redesignated Nigeria as a country of particular concern on religious freedom grounds, citing alleged widespread attacks on Christians. He publicly threatened to cut U.S. aid to Nigeria and instructed Pete Hegseth, the United States Department of War Secretary, to prepare for possible military intervention if the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians. This rhetoric or this approach, you would say, has generated alarm in Nigeria and abroad. And of particular interest are a group of people who have been identified as key lobbyists in the United States. We have one of them in the studio today, and he's going to discuss with us what role he has played or his organization has played, and why the United States considers the current unfortunate events in the United States as an attack on Christians, and if that is the right designation, or if there is any other thing behind that designation, and where we are going to, how we are going to get there, and if there are going to be any repercussions both for Nigeria and the United States. And if there is, what is going to be the repercussions for the rest of the continent? Mr. Elias Jurasulis, you are welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast.
It's an honor to be here, Bernard. It's a great pleasure to be on this show. I congratulate you on this very successful program that you've created. Bring eminent experts on Africa to speak about these issues of importance. So it's just an honor to be on your show, to have this discussion. In way of introduction, as you alluded to, I'm a lobbyist here in Washington, D.C., a partner with the firm Moran Global Strategies. I represent a number of international clients on the African continent. One of the clients that I represent, which we'll discuss more, is the Biafra Public Government in Exile, which is the political arm of the Biafra independence movement. And in that capacity, I've played an active role in shaping U.S.-Nigeria policy, including the current posture coming out of Washington, taking a very harsh stance against the government of Nigeria for a number of issues, including the Christian genocide that you mentioned. So I look forward to having this productive discussion.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that clarification, because you're making it very clear that you have a client. Therefore, I don't expect you to be very objective. I expect you to be subjective and defending the interests of your clients on this conversation. Am I right?
That's correct. I'm very open about who I represent. It's public information. And I think as a point of ethics, if people were to represent certain interests, they should make that clear when asked questions about those interests. So I think I have an obligation to tell the audience exactly how I'm involved with this, because I'm not simply a neutral outside observer. I'm active in shaping U.S.-Nigeria policy on behalf of certain interests. And I think I have a moral and ethical obligation to make that clear to you and the audience, and look forward to having a further discussion. And even though I do come with a certain perspective, I will make sure to separate whatever my personal opinions are from clearly established facts.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I just want to make a clarification here. You don't work for the State Department. So what you are saying is just your understanding of how the State Department and the government of the United States is operating, and the processes, how you read them from outside. Am I being right?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm a lobbyist, government relations consultant here in Washington, D.C., so I'm not an employee or representative of the U.S. government. That being said, I work closely with all the parts of the U.S. government, including our Congress, State Department, White House, National Security Council, and other agencies. So I'm not a representative of the State Department. I'm not a formal representative of the U.S. government, but these are all officials whom I talk to, who I work closely with, who I try to bring my information to and my perspective to. So I hope that provides a clarification.
So I want us to switch gears now and talk about Biafra. So we'll definitely talk about autocratic governments like the government of Cameroon when we talk about Biafra in this case. In an article by the Africa Report, they say former U.S. Congressman Jim Moran, who lent a voice to the indigenous people of Biafra movement in 2024, the situation in Nigeria reflects human rights abuses, religious freedom issues, persecution of Christians, increasing Islamic fundamentalism with the Nigerian government and its alignment with U.S. adversaries. But in his statement, Ambassador Jonathan Pratt says, Nigeria is one of the United States' key allies in Africa. Is your firm having this thing wrong?
No, I think not at all. I think one thing to clarify is the U.S. government is a very complex machinery. It works in a very unique way. On any particular issue, you'll have different parts of the U.S. government that may have different points of view, right? What matters is what's the overall political consensus among those who are the decision makers. In this case, when it comes to taking a strong stance against the government of Nigeria, you see extremely strong support in the United States Congress. I've worked with many of these members of Congress. That's now been reflected at the White House and in the National Security Council and the President of the United States himself. And ultimately, in the nature of the current U.S. government, what really matters is the policy stance of President Trump. The viewpoint of the president is reflective in U.S. government policy. This is different than, let's say, other administrations where decisions are made at a more bureaucratic level through the interagency process. In this case, what the U.S. government policy is the viewpoint of President Trump. The State Department tends to be a little bit more, how shall we say, conservative and risk averse usually. So that's why you have people like Ambassador Pratt making those comments, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the overall consensus and the viewpoint of the people who are the decision makers. Mind you, before this whole topic took off the past 2-3 months in terms of Christian genocide and the stance of the President of the United States, you had people like Masad Boulos, who's another senior State Department official, who try to argue that the Christians aren't being targeted and that maybe more Muslims are being killed. Mr. Boulos has had a past history with Nigeria, given his background, and has friendly relations with the president of Nigeria. But then the president of the United States decided to take a different stance, given the mood in Congress and other parts of the government. I guess what I'm trying to say is the stance of the U.S. government is very clear through the opinion of the president of the United States. President Trump has even made comments saying Nigeria is a disgrace. So with due respect, what really matters is the viewpoint of President Trump, his influential people in the White House, and his allies in the U.S. Congress. And Ambassador Pratt, I think, is speaking a diplomatic terminology, but that's not really driving the U.S. policy right now.
Yeah,
so I just want to give you that.
Yeah, that background was necessary. And somebody who's listening to us now, it's definitely asking, how did you get to President Trump's ears, whereas his own ambassador could not convince him on these issues?
Well, that's why lobbying is important here in Washington, D.C. It's to engage in an education campaign. For the past year, we've been very proactively lobbying members of the U.S. Congress, educating them on these issues, building alliances. And again, we can't take all the credit. You've also had some pro-Christian evangelical groups that were very active and also lobbying on behalf of similar issues, Christian persecution in Nigeria. And some of those groups we've allied and worked with and cooperated with in terms of our lobbying efforts. And because of the alliances we built in the U.S. Congress, and you had people like Senator Ted Cruz, who are extremely influential, who introduced legislation calling for sanctions on Nigeria, that penetrated into the White House, into places like the National Security Council, which is very influential in this particular White House. And eventually that percolated to the president, and the president decided to take action on the issue. So lobbying is systematic. You build alliances, and if you build enough alliances with influential members of Congress and other individuals who speak directly to the president, that can influence the viewpoint of the president of the United States. And also, too, I think this was very natural for the president because many of his supporters are people who are evangelicals or pro-Christian and so forth. So I think this was a very natural decision for him to make.
So based on these factors you have just outlined, what is your client's final objective?
They understand how international diplomacy is. That's why they're working closely through me with the U.S. government, and we're working on seeing how we can achieve the goal because it's going to take some time, and there are going to have to be transitionary processes as well as we work towards the eventual goal of independence. The creation of entities that are autonomous or newly independent states towards the eventual goal.
Let's talk again about the religious persecution and genocide as it's being presented. The Nigerian government has refused those claims and say they are gross misrepresentation of the reality. But when President Trump made his statement, supposedly Biafran diaspora was celebrating and jubilating. Do you think the Biafran diaspora is considering this as a win for their advocacy?
The president's actions are absolutely a win. And again, what the government of Nigeria is talking about is just complete nonsense. I mean, we see this recently in the life sentence of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, who's a prominent Biafran activist that was illegally kidnapped by the government of Nigeria in 2021 from Kenya. He's the Nelson Mandela of our time. He's been a peaceful activist for an independent Biafra. The government of Nigeria kidnaps that gentleman, drags out his trial for years, gives him a life sentence. Meanwhile, you have the president of Nigeria pardoning drug traffickers, murderers, and convicted Islamic terrorists. So a lot of not just Biafrans, but even other Nigerians, when they look at what's happening, they say, "Hey, how come the Nigerian government, in the case of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, is giving him a life sentence through this clearly politically motivated court case, and meanwhile the president of Nigeria is pardoning criminals, drug traffickers, and former terrorists?" So it's just when you have contrasts that are so stark, one can't help but come to the conclusion that there's a bias against both Biafrans and also Christians generally in Nigeria, because what else could possibly explain these type of discrepancies?
So you're saying that.
And this is not just my view, too. Recently, congressional hearing that you alluded to, a member of Congress, John James, highlighted the example of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu as the double standard Nigerian government example of Christian persecution in Nigeria. So again, this is not just my point of view, but the point of view of people in the U.S. government and point of view of people in Nigeria, both Biafrans and non-Biafrans. A lot of Nigerians, again, non-Biafrans, think that the Nigerian government's prosecution and life sentence of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu is completely ridiculous and absurd.
Yeah, I don't want to adjudicate.
Again, that's just one example to show you why what the Nigerian government says is just absurd.
That's right. I don't want to adjudicate those issues because we could have a different conversation on the judgment itself that was delivered 100 and something pages, but we could have a separate conversation on that one.
But that's just to answer your question, though. It seems that from the perspective of the government of Nigeria, simply having the viewpoint of supporting Biafran independence is a crime in and of itself. And I think that's just, again, completely absurd. People should have the right to free speech and the right to have different political viewpoints.
So what is the main leverage right now that the Biafran movement has as compared to the Republic of Nigeria, to the Federal Republic of Nigeria? Because the Biafran movement is actually advocating for independence, as you said. But at this material moment, it looks like President Trump is rather focused on bringing in sanity as regards Christians. So what leverage does the Biafran movement have to press the right buttons?
Well, we have a lot of support here in Washington, D.C. Again, there's certain things I can't go to due to their sensitivities, but we've met with senior people in Congress and the White House and other places as well. I think given the acknowledgement of the poor treatment of Christians in Nigeria, right, that there is a greater sympathy or openness towards having a separate Christian state in the south of the country, and in this case, Biafra. And the Biafrans, and I'll speak generally again because I can't go into private conversations, have a lot to offer the United States. The Biafrans have, as I'll talk about what's been mentioned in press reports, have offered military bases to the United States in the Gulf of Guinea. There are immense oil and gas deposits in Biafra. That's actually majority of Nigeria's oil and gas. The Biafrans will be more than happy to renegotiate more favorable contracts with U.S. oil and gas companies, cooperation with the U.S. government on counterterrorism, and other benefits. And the U.S. government is very much interested in having greater presence in West Africa. There have been a number of coups in the Sahel, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. We've lost some of our military installations and bases in those countries. There's an interest in having alternative allies in West Africa to make up for those losses so we can maintain a presence. And Biafra offers an ideal place for the U.S. to have presence in the Gulf of Guinea. And unfortunately, because the Nigerian government has just proven to be so problematic, and there have been efforts over the years to try to work with the government of Nigeria, and it's just been not very fruitful. There's an openness now to alternative allies. I'll give you another analogy in a different part of the continent. We have in East Africa, Somalia, which has been a failed state for a long time. You have the separate de facto state of Somaliland, which is self-governing, but they're not recognized yet by the U.S. or the international community as an independent country. That being said, because Somaliland is developing good relations with the U.S., they've made open offers to the United States in terms of bases, port deals, natural resource deals. You've had key people in the U.S. government, especially in the U.S. Congress, advocating for the recognition of the independence of Somaliland. President Trump has talked about him looking at Somaliland, and I think it's very likely that the U.S. government will make a deal and recognize the independence of Somaliland sometime during President Trump's term. So there is currently, with the existing administration and Congress, an openness to engage in deal making in Africa, which presents an opportunity for, again, depending on the right circumstances, independence movements in Africa, depending on, again, the circumstances and what they're willing to offer the United States.
Yeah. So why do these deals leave African states their sovereignty and the economic development? Because through independence, from independence till today, we've seen African states losing all their natural resources and their wealth generation to superpowers. And it sounds like these countries are offering all this to the United States to come continue the journey. So where do we stand? Look at Niger. All the uranium is gone, but there is no electricity in Niger. Nigeria, the oil and gas is all gone, but there is no consequential development. And then what I'm hearing from you is that is going to continue with the United States?
No, that's not what I'm saying. You make a good point in terms of, I think a lot of Africans have been exploited by what we could call neocolonialism, where even after, let's say, countries become quote unquote independent, they're still under undue influence by former colonial powers. I think one of the most controversial being France. And oftentimes the issue with some of the former European colonists, whether it's the French or the Belgium or some of these other powers, is they do business with their former colonies in a way that's exploitative, oftentimes trying to prop up puppet dictators, engaging in economic deals that are bad for those countries that are exploitative. That's not what I'm advocating for, and that is not what the U.S. is advocating for. In fact, I think a greater U.S. presence can offer an alternative for African governments to both kind of these neo-colonialist former powers, as well as an alternative to both the Russians and Chinese. And the way that the U.S. is, it's not this exploitative colonial model, but rather a business style model in which the U.S. can come and say, hey, how can we help make investments in your country such that we could both deepen our relations and we could both make money and prosper together. So it's the viewpoint is not in exploiting the countries or its natural resources, but rather having investments in these countries in which both the U.S. and those countries, whether it's the Biafrans or other places in Africa, where there can be a mutually benefit, where it could be a win-win situation. So
Yeah,
I want to say I
the problem
agree with,
is the problem is when I listen to you talk, you say the Nigerians or the Biafrans and the Somalis and the Somalilanders are willing to offer the oil and gas, natural resources, and ports for for the U.S. to come in. But I didn't hear the other part where they are coming to invest in those countries so they can generate the wealth within those countries and create
that's exactly what I'm
jobs.
saying. For where the U.S. can come in, but to make investments to help the Biafrans or to, let's say, help Somaliland take advantage of their natural resources in such a way that the U.S. benefits, but those countries also benefit. And that's a much better model in terms of, let's say, what the Biafrans currently have, where their oil and gas are exploited by both these companies as well as the government of Nigeria, and none of the benefits of that wealth benefits the people of the area. So, we have I think we can have a situation where Biafra, that can determine its own destiny, can have friendships with countries like the United States that can make investments, right, in its oil and gas industries and other industries where the people of Biafra can finally benefit from their own wealth, their own natural resources. Of course, it'll be of a benefit to the United States as well. So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah.
We
So
want to explore
so far,
economic
what is
partnerships.
so
Economic.
far what is the blueprint from the Biafran side that they're offering to the United States? Because as you say, I understand President Trump's foreign policy is driven by national security and investment, which he considers to be economic security, both for the United States and for the foreign countries. But at this point, what is the kind of blueprint, if it is not confidential? Tell us, what is the blueprint that Biafra is offering? Do they already have some numbers? Do they have what they're looking at and saying, okay, if we do this, Trump comes in and offers this, then our country is going to benefit by this? If not, wouldn't they be falling back into the situation that we find in Nigeria today?
Yeah, so we do have a blueprint. I'm just telling you the generalities of the blueprint, right? In terms of the areas in which we're already having discussions with the U.S., in terms of the oil and gas investments, U.S. Biafra defense relations, and in terms of potential bases and also counterterrorism cooperation and other areas. So I could speak generally in terms of this is what we're offering. There are some more specific things, but again, I can't go into those particular details due to sensitivities. But I'm just telling you what the general items are, which some of this is in the news and public reports. We are having some more specific conversations. I can't go into those specifics.
All right. So, what is the advantage of having a lobbyist in DC instead of doing or talking to these people yourselves? Because the senators, their doors are open to the public, open to their constituents. They listen to their constituents and receive them. Why should someone be hiring you to go talk on his behalf?
Yeah, so the way I would explain lobbying is similar to how you have a professional attorney that you hire to navigate you through the political process, through the legal process. You hire a lobbyist to help you navigate through the political process. And I think there's a term in law that any client who tries to represent themselves in court is foolish, right? There's this phrase for attorneys. And I know you have a legal background yourself. So someone can represent themselves, let's say in court or at trial, but they're better off having a professional attorney helping them through that process. The same thing goes for the political process, where the U.S. government is extraordinarily complicated to navigate, and people like myself have the knowledge and expertise as to how to navigate the U.S. government, and we provide advice and counsel to our clients in terms of how to best navigate through the U.S. government, who are the right people to meet with, and also how the information should be conveyed and what the message should be. So we act similar in a very similar way as attorneys do. And also people like myself, we have established relations with members of Congress. So a lot of members of Congress are people in the U.S. government. They know me. There's a certain comfort. There's a certain understanding that if I'm to introduce someone, let's say to a member of Congress, that person is vetted, that the cause that I'm representing is legitimate because I have these relations and I'm established here in Washington, D.C. So it produces a certain comfort to be introduced by a party that's known by both sides versus, let's say, someone approaches a member of Congress who they don't know who that person is, right? And the same thing applies to life in general. More comfortable when you're introduced to someone else by someone who you already know, who you have friendly relations with, who you trust. So I have established relations with members of Congress and other people in the U.S. government. They know me, they know my expertise, and that allows me to be essentially a facilitator between myself and these worthy causes. So I hope that gives some perspective.
It does give the perspective, and but it's expensive to hire a lobbyist to do this work in DC on your behalf, not being sure of the outcome.
It's an investment that I think should be viewed as a political investment, and it's something that's very effective. That's why so many countries and international causes hire lobbyists. And I think given the results that we've achieved, and this is not just me saying it, senior officials in the government of Nigeria have openly attacked me and have blamed my lobbying and so forth. So even the Nigerian government itself, you could say, has acknowledged the effectiveness of my lobbying, although they're not happy about it, whereas my client is happy about it. So I think clients can decide the effectiveness of the services given the results. In this case, we've achieved, I think, significant results. And in fact, there's even a tweet, I forget by who, but there's a tweet online that went viral, 500,000 tweets, saying, the lobbying campaign that our firm engaged on behalf of the Biafrans was one of the best returns on investment in history, which I think was a little bit flowery. But, clients can judge, and people can generally judge in terms of, whether or not a lobbyist is achieving results and influencing opinion or not.
So Biafrans are already happy while they have not yet had their independence? You say, is that what you're telling me?
Well, Well, Biafrans are happy about the results we're achieving, but we're still working towards the goal. Achieving a newly independent state in Africa or anywhere takes time. We've engaged in our lobbying campaign. I've been involved in representing the Biafrans for a little bit more than a year now. In the cases of some countries, it's taken decades for them to obtain their freedom and independence. So we've achieved a lot in a short period of time, and we're working towards the goal. These things don't happen magically overnight, and anyone who says that they're going to achieve a newly independent state overnight is not a serious person, in my opinion. These statecraft takes time, especially if you want to do it the right way.
I don't want to go so much into that. That was not the focus of our conversation today. But you've mentioned the Biafrans and Somaliland that are advocating for independence. And the Ambazonian movement is linked with the Biafran movement. And the leaders of the Ambazonian movement and the leaders of the Biafran movement are in jail. Do you have any relationship with the Ambazonian movement?
Yes, so I also have experience with the Ambazonian movement. I am the lobbyist here in Washington, D.C. for the Ambazonian Governing Council. And so I have an understanding of the Ambazonian cause as well. And, it's something that has relations to Biafra, as you said, because Amazonia and Biafra, those regions border each other, and some of the Biafran groups have collaboration with Ambazonian groups.
And are you proud that you're putting yourself in the middle of a region that is likely being destabilized in Africa?
Well, the way I view it is I hope I could play a constructive role in terms of coming to positive conclusions in these issues. Because I think if you don't have, let's say, any sort of international interest or U.S. Mediation, let's say, for example, in the case of Cameroon, you've had the Anglophone crisis for the past, I think, 9 years now, and it hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves. I think highlighting the issues to the U.S. and the international community and trying to get some interest in terms of resolving the problem that can be helpful. So I view myself as trying to have a positive role in in an area that has had conflict and instability, and trying to be constructive, because otherwise some of these conflicts will continue to be neglected and the problems will just continue to worsen.
So President Trump is on record as saying he has resolved at least eight conflicts around the world and he wants to prevent other conflicts. If you were to advise President Trump about conflicts, let's say you meet President Trump today and you were to talk to him about conflicts in Africa, what are the three top conflicts you're going to talk to him about?
Yes, so obviously I would talk to him about the Ambazonia, Cameroon conflict, the Anglophone crisis. I think President Trump, who has negotiated 8 or so peace agreements or negotiations, that would be a perfect place where he could be a mediator. Obviously, I would talk to him about Biafra and our interest in, having the U.S. Play a role in deal making with Biafra. You mentioned a third. There are a number of conflicts that could also be highlighted. You have what's happening in Sudan, for example. President Trump has indicated that he now wants to get involved in resolving the conflict in Sudan, and I commend him for that. So I think Sudan is something I would mention. You've also have had a tremendous amount of instability in Central African Republic. That's another place you could look into as well. So those are other areas that I think the president should look into. And again, I'm very pleased now that President Trump, in a tweet or Truth Social, the president enjoys social media, has finally mentioned what's happening in Sudan, which has been, again, one of those areas that has been neglected. A big part of the problem is some of these conflicts just receive absolutely no attention, and people are suffering. And I think just having some attention to these issues is so important. So again, this sometimes happens here in Washington, and I think that's perfectly fine. I think we should have a healthy competition of ideas, and then U.S. officials can make their own best judgment.
All right, I want to give you a hypothetical here. It's a practical example, and I hear how that plays out. Cameroon on October 12th had presidential elections. The Constitutional Council declared Paul Biya the winner, that is the incumbent president. Issa Chiruma on the other side published results from the polling stations, and those results showed he won. But the Constitutional Council and the elections management body have not published the results polling station by polling station. Now, If you are hired to represent Chiruma to make a case to the United States Senate and government, what would be your best strategy?
Well, what I would say is, and again, these are things that I already highlight in my capacity of representing the Ambazonians. But Paul Biya has been a longtime dictator in Africa. He's 93 now. He wants to be president until I think he's 100, which I think will be a record. And Cameroon, under his tenure, has not had free and fair elections. They've been Cameroonians, whether they be Ambazonians or other Cameroonians, have had a history of being oppressed under the Biya dictatorship. And I think someone, the Cameroonian opposition, individuals such as Chiroma, can make the argument that a democratic Cameroon will be better for the people of Cameroon and will also create a situation of a healthier Cameroon that would be a better partner for the United States that can help stabilize the situation within Cameroon. Part of the reason why you've had instability in the country, whether it's the Anglophone crisis or other problems, is because of the mismanagement of the Biya government. And I think Cameroonian opposition can make the argument to the United States that many of the problems in Cameroon could be resolved if you had a friendly, democratic government which can resolve the problems of the people instead of the situation with the Biya regime where there's suppression and then you have revolts and all these other problems that have come as a reaction to that. So I think there's a persuasive case at this moment that the opposition could make, and you have members of Congress, especially members of Congress like the Senate Foreign Relations Chairman, who are skeptical of the Biya regime, and others. Yeah, the Biya regime has many critics in the U.S. for their lack of democracy and many other problems.
And if Biya's lobbyist comes in and says, we have a stable government that has stabilized the country for the last 43 years, and we are critical for the stability of the Gulf of Guinea, if we change the system, there is a high probability that the country may go into full-blown crisis, considering the case of the Northwest and the Southwest and the North and the East. And if they say they have held some balance for all this while, and that is what they need for the country right now, how would you counter such an argument?
Yeah, I'm sure that's what they would say. But what I would say is, again, the situation has completely come out of control. Under the Biya regime, the situation in the country is not stable, as we've seen with the Anglophone crisis, and that's because of policies of the Biya government. And also, too, he's 93 years old. He doesn't have much more time. His end is inevitable given his age. Regardless, there's going to be a change because at some point,
So if he's going to amend the constitution because he has a majority in parliament and appoint a vice president who takes over from him to ensure continuity, what would you say?
Well, what I would say is there are many people who are dissatisfied with this style of the Biya regime, which is autocratic in nature. And there are many people in Cameroon that would like to experience true democracy. And so I think that's something that should be given a chance. And I think it will be a beacon of hope, especially a country that's important like Cameroon. If it were to have a transition to democracy, I think that would be a positive development in the region. So I think there's an argument that can be made and should be made there by the Cameroonian opposition.
Thank you so much, Elias, for coming to the Beyond Africa podcast. Do you have any last word for our viewers?
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. What I say is this is a very interesting time in the continent. I think some of these liberation movements, like the Biafra independence movement and other pro-democracy causes in the continent, should be receiving more attention. I'm glad that some of these issues are receiving attention, but I think more attention needs to be paid to Africa. Africa is often overlooked, even though it's so critical and so important. And so I appreciate the role that your program has in terms of creating additional awareness and appreciation for Africa. And it's a pleasure to be on your program.
Thank you so much. We seek to give in-depth time to actors who are discussing and managing issues on Africa because traditional media does not give that amount of time, and we want to have our perspectives on the news, so we share those views. For example, the news would go on saying there is no genocide in Nigeria, But irrespective of the term that has been used, what is important is there is violence and there is need for security because the government is failing. And when we have such conversations, we have a different view of what is happening around the world. And that is the essence of the Beyond Africa podcast. We are here to tell African stories to change lives in Africa. And thank you again for coming to the Beyond Africa podcast, Elias Jurasulis. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. What a time to be alive and what a time to follow African politics. I have been your host, Ngalim Bernard. See you in the next episode of the Beyond Africa podcast.